Nicknamed Peashooter, the P-39 Airacobra was maligned by many. If there is an American combat airplane that has achieved an ill-deserved reputation, no doubt it would be the much-maligned Bell P-39 Airacobra, a tricycle landing gear single-engine fighter whose reputation was greatly overshadowed by the more famous, slowest, and of more recent design, Lockheed P-38 Lightning, Curtiss P-40 Tomahawk, Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, and North American P-51 Mustang. In the minds of some, the P-39 was a practically worthless airplane with few redeeming features. They consider the nickname used by P-39 pilots, Peashooter, a term of derision that implies the airplane's effectiveness as a fighter. But the P-39's many detractors ignore the reputation of the Airacobra with the Soviet Air Force and the important role it played in the Southwest Pacific area of operations in 1942, when P-39s were the only fighters available, thanks at least in part to the decision not to use them in large numbers in the European theater. And if considering overall capabilities, instead of concentrating solely on certain features, the P-39 comes off as a capable fighter. While it is true that the P-39 lacked the high-altitude performance needed to excel as an interceptor, it had other attributes that made it a successful combat airplane. When Bell Aircraft was designing the single-engine fighter, U.S. defense plans centered around the possibility of repelling naval attacks and possible landings on American shores. Little attention was paid to the high-altitude performance needed to intercept formations of enemy bombers because the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans provided the best possible defense from foreign attack. No country possessed the capabilities of mounting a transoceanic air attack in 1935, and the United States had yet to seriously consider the possibility of combat in Europe or around what would come to be known as the Pacific Rim. Consequently, the U.S. Army wanted airplanes that were more suitable for attacking invading ground forces and/or naval landing parties than for intercepting enemy formations at high altitude. So Bell designed its new interceptor around the Allison V1710 engine without turbochargers, even though the engine in the prototype was turbocharged, and concentrated more on low-altitude maneuverability and firepower than high-altitude or climb performance. Thus, the Airacobra featured short wings that allowed it to turn on a dime, but greatly reduced its climb performance due to their overall area. Its best speed of 368 miles per hour was reached at 13,800 feet. At higher altitudes, performance began to degrade rapidly, and the airplane had reached its maximum ceiling by the mid-20s range. Unfortunately, developing events in Europe were soon dictating air combat at altitudes over 30,000 feet. The P-39 was also unique. Not only was it the first operational tricycle landing gear single-engine fighter, it was the only U.S.-manufactured military airplane with the engine located in the center of the fuselage instead of in the nose. The P-39's pilot actually sat in front of the engine, directly over a drive shaft that was modified so that a 37mm cannon fired through the propeller hub. It was this feature that led to the Peashooter nickname, a term that was already in wide use in the Army Air Corps long before P-39s entered combat in the Southwest Pacific. The cannon was an effective weapon that could be deadly against bombers and ground targets, although the 37mm shell was a bit small to do much damage to heavier armored vehicles such as larger tanks. Additional armament consisted of a pair each of 30 caliber machine guns mounted on top of the nose, synchronized to fire through the propeller blades. 2.50 caliber machine guns were added in the wings for combat. The Airacobra's armament was eventually increased to 6 50 caliber machine guns, 2 on the nose and 2 in each wing, and the 37mm cannon, a powerful package that made the P-39 an ideal ground attack airplane. Hardpoints were added to allow the Airacobra to carry bombs. But it was not in the ground attack role that P-39s initially saw service. The Airacobra was one of the first American fighters to be exported. An export version, designated as the P-400, was produced for delivery to British forces, who called it the Airacobra I. The first P-400s were produced to fill a French order, but none had been delivered before France fell. Britain picked up the French orders for American aircraft, including the P-400. Compared to the P-39, the P-400 was lightly armed, with only a 20mm cannon and two .30 caliber machine guns mounted in the wings instead of on the nose. Beginning in October 1941, Royal Air Force fighter squadrons operated P-400s for a short time, but they were soon withdrawn from combat due to their lack of high-altitude performance. After having become accustomed to high-altitude combat during the Battle of Britain, the RAF pilots were not impressed with the Airacobra, and the airplane's disparaging reputation began, or at least that is the point at which some historians have decided it was a worthless airplane. Actually, many of the pilots who flew the P-39 thought it a joy to fly. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, the U.S. took over the British contract. A large number of reclaimed P-400s saw service with U.S. Army Air Corps squadrons that were sent to Australia, where they proved inadequate as interceptors, while others served in North Africa. The Airacobra's problems were due to the combination of the design's short wings and the lack of a supercharged engine, which kept it from attaining more than medium altitudes. Instead of electing to correct the problems and trying to turn the Airacobra into a high-altitude interceptor, the United States Army decided to forego the addition of superchargers since new, high-performance fighters, such as the P-47 and P-38, were entering production. Those who flew the P-39 and P-400 would have to take them into combat as they were. Airacobras went into combat without modifications that might have made them more suitable as interceptors for another reason. Along with Curtiss P-40s, they were the only American-built fighters available in large numbers in early 1942 that were not obsolete, and they were badly needed in the Pacific. Immediately after Pearl Harbor, the Army Air Corps began dispatching Airacobra-equipped squadrons to Australia. The 35th Pursuit Group had actually set sail for Manila 2 days before the attack on Pearl Harbor, and the men of 2 of its squadrons were already there flying P-40s, but no Airacobras had reached the Philippines before the December 8 attack. The Pursuit designation was changed to Fighter when the Army Air Forces reorganized in early 1942. After the attack, the group headquarters returned to the U.S. for a few weeks, but was in place in Australia shortly after the first of the year. Many of the pilots who had gone to the Philippines rejoined the group there. The 35th Group's squadrons began equipping with P-400s that had been delivered from the United States by ship and went into training for combat. The 8th Pursuit Group also moved to Australia, and its P-39s were soon operating from forward bases in New Guinea. Those 2 groups, along with the P-40-equipped 49th Pursuit Group, would constitute the nucleus of the soon-to-be-famous V Fighter Command, which would ultimately gain air superiority in the Southwest Pacific. But with the Airacobras, the pilots of the 2 groups would be at a distinct disadvantage in their initial role as interceptors. Early on, the Army planned to send Airacobras to England with the 8th Air Force, and 2 P-39 groups were assigned to it in early 1942 when the 8th was organized. At the time, the planned mission of the 8th Air Force was to support the Allied landings in North Africa that were scheduled for later in the year. The Allied defeat in Java, followed by the threat to the United States as the Japanese fleet steamed toward Midway Island, led to a cancellation of the planned invasion, although a revised plan was reinstated after the U.S. victory at Midway. The new 8th Air Force lost most of its combat groups to the Pacific, then was selected to reorganize and go to England as the British Isles Air Force. Two groups, the 31st and 52nd, trained with P-39s, but the problem of flying the single-engine fighters across the North Atlantic led to a decision to send the pilots and ground personnel to England by ship and to leave their airplanes behind. When they got to England, the two groups re-equipped with British Supermarine Spitfires. The lightweight Spitfires cost considerably less than the more rugged Airacobras. Another group, the 81st Fighter Group, equipped with P-39s and former RAF P-400s in England, then deployed to North Africa, as did the 68th Observation Group. The 99th Fighter Squadron, the original Tuskegee Airmen, trained in the United States with P-39s before going overseas and flew them in combat in North Africa and the Mediterranean. By mid-March 1942, 90 P-39s and more than 100 of the P-400 derivative had been shipped to Australia. The P-39s went to the 8th Fighter Group, while the 35th, which was reorganizing in Australia with pilots who had come out of the Philippines, received the P-400s. 5 squadrons of P-39s were also distributed across the South Pacific, with squadrons at Fiji, Christmas Island, Canton, New Caledonia, and Palmyra. 4 of the 5 squadrons, the 67th, 68th, 70th, and 339th, would be formed into the 347th Fighter Group in October 1942, with the group headquarters on New Caledonia until it moved to Guadalcanal late in 1943. Another squadron of P-39s was part of the 18th Fighter Group. Some South Pacific squadrons would still be flying P-39s in early 1944. A P-39 squadron was also dispatched to Alaska. But it would be in New Guinea that P-39s would enter combat, and it was there and in the nearby Solomons that they would play their greatest role with U.S. forces. In the spring of 1942, the mission of Allied air forces in the Southwest Pacific was the defense of Australia. Immediately upon his arrival there from the Philippines, General Douglas MacArthur decided that the battle line should be drawn in New Guinea. The original Allied plan had been to withdraw south of a line in Central Australia and organize a defense of the more populated southern half of the country, but the idea of giving up more territory to the Japanese was anathema to MacArthur. The loss of the Philippines had affected him deeply, and his every effort was devoted to offense rather than a continuing retreat deep into Australia. He elected to defend Australia by holding the line in New Guinea until he had sufficient strength to go on the offensive and drive the Japanese off the huge island. While the 49th Fighter Group took its P-40s to Darwin, which had come under Japanese air attack from Java, an advanced echelon of the 8th Fighter Group moved its P-39s in April into Port Moresby on the south coast of Papua New Guinea, and immediately they began combat operations. Although the pilots of the 8th Fighter Group were flying an airplane that lacked the performance to meet the Japanese at high altitude, their P-39s could hold their own at the lower altitudes, and they were led by pilots with combat experience in the where Army Air Corps pilots and gunners had destroyed as many Japanese aircraft in the air and on the ground as had been lost. Lieutenant Colonel Boyd "Buzz" Wagner was one such commander. As a young lieutenant flying P-40s, he had quickly achieved a reputation for aggressive action in daring attacks on Japanese airfields in the first weeks of the war. An aeronautical engineer by training, he knew the capabilities of the Japanese fighters as well as those of his own aircraft, and his skill and knowledge quickly put itself to good use in New Guinea. On the afternoon of April 30, 1942, Wagner led a formation of 26 Airacobras on their first combat mission, a strafing of the Japanese airfields and fuel dumps at Lae and Salamaua. They encountered Japanese fighters and engaged in an intense dogfight. 4 P-39s were lost, but the Americans claimed 3 Japanese fighters shot down. Unfortunately, the losses were especially severe, since 11 P-39s had failed to reach Port Moresby during the flight up from Australia, and every airplane was badly needed. But there was a bright spot. All of the P-39 pilots were rescued, and only one was seriously injured. In 2 months of combat in New Guinea, the 39th Squadron shot down 12 Japanese aircraft for a loss of 9 of their own, but did not lose a single pilot. The only serious injury came when a pilot bailed out at high speed and struck his airplane's surface.
Japanese bombers came over in time to intercept them. It was not that the Airacobras were vulnerable to Japanese fighters.
They simply lacked the climb performance to reach the altitudes at which the Japanese were operating. During the month of July, P-39s only managed to intercept the Japanese formations 4 times during 9 air raids. The P-40s had somewhat better high-altitude performance and attempted to intercept the Japanese formations, but most of their efforts were equally unsuccessful due to a lack of time to gain enough altitude. Furthermore, the P-40s of the 49th Fighter Group were needed to defend Darwin, which was becoming a major Allied base. So, the fighter role in New Guinea remained the responsibility of the P-39s. Attacks. The P-400s were particularly ineffective as interceptors due to their lack of heavy armament, but with racks for bombs, they were well suited for ground attack. On August 8th, a 32-plane formation struck Japanese supply dumps on the north side of the Owen Stanley Mountains in one of the first ground attack missions in the theater. On August 22nd, an advance element from the 67th Fighter Squadron arrived at Henderson Field on Guadalcanal with 5 P-400s. The remainder of the squadron arrived 5 days later, and the Army pilots began operations under the control of Marine Aircraft Wing 1 and became part of the Cactus Air Force. After initially attempting to intercept Japanese aircraft, the squadron only had 3 airplanes still in commission after only 4 days of operations. Recognizing that the Army P-400s were attempting a mission beyond the airplane's capabilities, the Marines changed the squadron's mission to ground attack. Soon, the P-400s were doing everything but fighting at high altitude, including strafing, dive bombing, and attacking Japanese shipping. The P-400s did possess one advantage over the Navy and Marine fighters at Henderson Field. They were able to take off in mud that kept the other types on the ground. Unfortunately, this ability did little good in the mission of intercepting Japanese bombers at high altitude, but it did allow the P-400s to provide close air support for the soldiers and Marines fighting the Japanese on the ground when the Marine and Navy aircraft could not. A handful of P-39s were brought onto the island to supplement the P-400s and Marine fighters, but even though they were able to operate at higher altitudes than the P-400s, they were still unable to reach the Japanese bombers, which were operating at 30,000 feet. By December, there were 3 squadrons of P-39s and P-400s on the island, and they joined Marine Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers in attacks on Japanese ground troops and supply areas. Marine records reported that, in one instance, P-39s harassed the enemy all day. In addition to strafing and dropping conventional bombs, the P-39s also began delivering gasoline bombs, which would come to be known as napalm. P-39s continued to play a large role in the Solomons campaign throughout 1943 and were still active when Air Solomons assumed responsibility for the destruction of Rabaul from 5th Air Force in early 1944. In September 1942, a new weapon appeared just over the treetops of Papua New Guinea, a weapon that led to a change in tactics by the 5th Air Force that took advantage of the low-altitude fighting capabilities of its P-39s and P-400s. In July, the first of the Douglas A-20 Havoc light bombers that were to equip the 3rd Bombardment Group Light arrived in Australia. Modifications were soon made to the A-20s, including the addition of a package of 50 caliber machine guns in the nose so that they could be used in the ground attack role rather than as a light bombers. On September 12, 1942, the A-20s made their combat debut in an attack on the Japanese airfield at Buna. The results of the attack were so impressive that low-altitude attack became the stock in trade of the V-Bomber Command. Previously, V-Bomber Command light and medium bombers had attacked at comparatively high altitudes, but the new low-level tactics called for low-altitude fighter escorts, and this was a task for which the Airacobras were well suited. The low-altitude attacks on Japanese airfields and other installations forced the Japanese fighters to come down to the lower altitudes where the P-39s could meet them on their own terms. Several of the 5th Air Force aces, including Captain Tommy Lynch, got their first kills while flying P-39s. The Airacobras added to the carnage of the attack missions by coming in on the heels of the A-20s to strafe with their own guns and powerful cannons. Another frequent P-39 mission was providing escort for 5th Air Force troop carrier transports. Immediately upon arriving in Australia, General Kenny began advocating the use of transport aircraft to move troops into battle in forward areas and to keep them supplied. 5th Air Force transports kept the Australians supplied, and they were protected from Japanese fighters by the P-39s. In mid-1943, Kenny decided to establish a forward airfield at Silly Silly using troop carrier transports to bring in construction crews and supplies. The C-47 transports which executed the mission were escorted by P-39s. When Japanese fighters attacked a flight of C-47s as they were preparing to land at the new airfield with maintenance personnel from a fighter squadron, P-39s broke up the attack. Throughout 1942 and 1943, the escort of transports operating in forward areas was a major mission of the P-39s. Late December 1942 saw the appearance of a new fighter in the Southwest Pacific and a consequential change in tactics by V Fighter Command. Although several Lockheed P-38 Lightnings had been in Australia since late summer, the twin-engine fighters required extensive modification to make them suitable for combat. Then followed several dry weeks as the Japanese refused to engage them. During the U.S. Christmas holiday week, the P-38s had their first combat with the Japanese and very quickly demonstrated that the Allied air forces now had a fighter that could meet the Japanese on their own terms and defeat them. With the advent of the P-38, the P-39s were relieved of the frustrating duty of attempted intercept and were able to devote their attention to the ground attack and low-altitude escort missions for which they were so well suited. They were also able to fight the Japanese fighters and bombers when the P-38s drove them down to lower altitudes. Still, the Airacobra's days with V Fighter Command were numbered. As more P-38s and P-47s became available for duty in the Southwest Pacific, P-39s were replaced. By mid-1944, most of the former P-39 squadrons had converted to P-38s. The introduction of American-flown Airacobras to combat in Europe lacked the urgency with which the 8th Pursuit Group went to New Guinea in April 1942. Shortly after the attack on Pearl Harbor, President Franklin Roosevelt and Prime Minister Winston Churchill agreed to defeat Germany first while fighting a holding action in the Pacific. Unlike the Pacific, where Japanese forces continued to advance until the late summer of 1942, the advance of Axis forces in Europe had been halted, and the Allied plan was to begin an offensive designed to push them back into Germany. There was an abundance of British Hawker Hurricanes and Spitfires with the capability to intercept German and Italian bomber formations, while the U.S. Army Air Forces built up its strength in England in advance of the invasion of North Africa. Airacobras saw action in North Africa, mostly in the ground attack role. The 81st Fighter Group, equipped with a mixture of P-39s and P-400s in England in the summer of 1942, then flew to North Africa in December. Although the British had not been impressed with the P-400 export version of the Airacobra, the P-39 had capabilities that the Soviet Air Force leaders were looking for. Having been in constant ground combat since June 1941, when Hitler elected to stab Stalin in the back and launch his invasion of the Soviet Union, the principal role of the Soviet Air Force had become ground attack, the role for which the Airacobra had been designed. Deliveries to the Soviets began in the late summer of 1942, when 50 P-39s were part of a consignment of Lend-Lease aircraft that were delivered to Soviet ferry pilots at Fairbanks, Alaska. The United States Army Ferrying Command had been established before the U.S. entered the war to ferry American-built airplanes from the factories to delivery points where they were picked up by pilots from the receiving countries or loaded aboard ships for overseas delivery. Deliveries to the Soviet Union had been difficult due to enemy action and the harsh desert conditions around the Persian Gulf where ships with Soviet supplies were routed. It was possible to fly the Airacobras overland from the United States to Alaska, then across the Bering Sea to Siberia, and on into the Soviet interior. However, there were international issues that had to be worked out. The Soviets were not anxious to have American aircrews operating in the areas of their country that were in close proximity to territory held by the Japanese, with whom the Soviets remained neutral. After months of frustrating negotiations, the U.S. Army and the Soviets worked out an arrangement under which Soviet pilots, some of whom were women, would pick up U.S.-built airplanes in Alaska, then deliver them to combat units in the Soviet interior. The Ferrying Division of the Air Transport Command, which replaced the Ferrying Command in mid-1942, developed a route from St. Louis to airfields in Alaska. Other departure points were developed as the war continued. More than 5,000 P-39s were ultimately delivered to the Soviets, with the majority of them delivered via the Alaska route. With the increasing role of the P-38s and P-47s in combat in the Southwest Pacific, the need for the P-39s in the theater gradually diminished as more of the newer and more capable fighters came into operation. The War Production Board elected to discontinue P-39 production in favor of other types. The last P-39s rolled off the assembly lines at the Bell plants in western New York in August 1944, and the last of the type was delivered to the Soviet Air Force in September. By this time, the former P-39 squadrons in the South and Southwest Pacific were making the transition to P-38s or P-47s. The poor high-altitude performance of the P-39 led Bell to seek improvements in the type. In December 1942, the prototype P-63 King Cobra made its maiden flight. With a slightly larger tail, a four-bladed propeller, and a more powerful engine than the P-39, the P-63 had significantly better performance than its predecessor. But by the time the P-63 entered production, the U.S. Army Air Forces were concentrating on P-38s, P-47s, and P-51s, and were not interested in the King Cobra as a combat airplane. Consequently, the Soviet Air Force was its primary user. The first P-63s were delivered to the Soviets in June 1944, but the Soviets were not happy with the airplane and requested several design changes, including the installation of a ventral fin to improve lateral stability. Many modern writers lament the poor performance of the P-39, but without placing their observations in the proper context. Compared to the later models and to other aircraft, such as the British Spitfire, that had been designed for high-altitude operations, the P-39 was severely lacking if only considered in the context of the interceptor role. However, as a ground attack aircraft, it was a very effective airplane, and it could more than hold its own in air-to-air combat at low altitude. The Airacobra's reputation as an extremely rugged little airplane whose pilots usually survived when one was shot down is often overlooked. Although its lack of high-altitude performance hampered the P-39's effectiveness as an interceptor, it is important to remember that the Airacobras literally held the line in New Guinea against the Japanese in the summer and fall of 1942. By the end of that year, the slightly more capable Curtiss P-40s could be moved up from Darwin, and the Lockheed P-38 finally entered combat and began turning the tide of war. And the Russians loved the rugged little fighter. Sam McGowan is a frequent contributor to WWH history. He is the author of The Cave, a novel of the Vietnam War, and resides in Missouri City, Texas.